Well, welcome along to the show. I'm Justin Briley, your host for the next hour and a half here on Premier Christian Radio, and indeed across the world via the internet, where you can find our podcast at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. This is the show that gets Christians and non-Christians talking, and it's great to have you with me. And I'm doing a rather special thing today. Rather than having a Christian and a non-Christian join me in the studio as normal, I'm actually going to be playing you a series of interviews that I've conducted both recently and further back in the past, as we look forward to something very special, the Bethinking National Apologetics Day Conference.
You're unbelievable.
It's an exciting conference coming up as part of the Reasonable Faith Tour with William Lane Craig. Now, find out details about the whole of the tour at premier.org.uk/Craig. A wonderful array of debates and events going on that Bill Craig is leading. But you can also find out details about the National Day of Apologetics training that's happening in London on the weekend of that tour, on Saturday the 22nd of October, in 3 weeks' time. If you haven't yet signed up for it, I encourage you to do so. Some fantastic guests coming on the speaking rota for that day. You're going to be hearing from the likes of John Lennox, who is well known as a professor of mathematics from Oxford University with a strong Christian faith. He's going to be looking at the claims of the new atheism in regards to science. He's going to be speaking on responding to Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design. We're also going to be hearing today on the programme from Gary Habermas, who is a well-respected New Testament scholar and an expert on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, he's going to be presenting a lecture at the National Apologetics Day Conference, and we're going to be hearing from him today in his work on apologetics and the resurrection. Another key speaker is Peter J. Williams. He's going to be joining me as well on today's programme, looking ahead to the conference and what he'll be talking about in terms of the new atheist attack on the Old Testament. And, of course, the person who is leading the whole of the week or more that we're doing for this tour is William Lane Craig, and he's going to be delivering the first and final lecture of that day conference, and he's going to be talking on evidence for God and the need for apologetics in the church. It's all about being able to answer the tough questions of atheists. In fact, the subtitle of the conference is Countering the New Atheism. So I hope you're going to be able to join us for what promises to be a really excellent day of teaching and learning at the Bethinking National Apologetics Day Conference. You can find out full details at the Bethinking website, bethinking.org/Craig. That's got the details of the whole of the tour, the various debates that are going on, and that begins, of course, on Monday, the 17th of October, at the start of that week, with myself hosting a debate at Westminster Central Hall between William Lane Craig and atheist philosopher Stephen Law. Do get yourself booked in for that. Plus, there's more stuff going on in that week in Cambridge. There's going to be another debate in Birmingham. And, of course, this Apologetics Day Conference towards the end of that week, plus more in the week after. You can find the tickets at premier.org.uk/Craig. Well, let's kick off today's programme, and we're going to start off with something of an interview that I had recently with Bill. You won't have heard this before. This is exclusive new content, Bill talking about the forthcoming tour with me, and if you want to hear the full conversation we had, then do go to the Unbelievable website, where we're putting up the whole of the conversation I had with Bill recently, where we ranged far and wide on his life and what's been happening in regard to all the news about this tour and some of the background to it. That's also going to form the main part of a written interview with Bill in the forthcoming November edition of Christianity magazine. So if you manage to get hold of that, sort of landing sort of early October usually, then do get hold of that as well. But here I am talking to Bill, and starting off by asking him what his expectations and hopes are for the forthcoming Reasonable Faith Tour.
Well, I would like to raise the profile of intelligent Christianity in British culture so that people can see that a thinking, rational person can be a Christian. And I would also like to challenge students who are open and seeking to find the truth about God and the world to think about committing their lives to Christ and to becoming Christians.
Well, it's a very worthy aim, and I'm sure we're going to, get an awful lot out of your stay here, Bill. You've obviously, as I've mentioned, debated these new atheist megastars, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. I mean, the new atheism, is it gaining ground? Is it a threat to Christianity? What's your view on it as a movement?
Well, it is a pop cultural movement, Justin. It's not one that represents a serious intellectual movement within the academy. But in pop culture, I think it's tremendously influential, and I take it very seriously. I do think that they have the momentum going on their side, and that it's very important that we Christians respond to it and expose it for the superficiality that it really is.
One atheist blog said after your Hitchens debate that you spanked Hitchens like a foolish child. Now, obviously, the debate format is by its nature adversarial, winners and losers, prestige or humiliation. Is there a danger in this kind of presentation?
I don't think there's a danger from my point of view because I never attacked the other person. I treated Christopher Hitchens with utmost respect in that debate, and so I never will use derogatory or personal attacks. I'm interested in showing that the case for Christian theism is better than the case that my opponent is defending, whether that be atheism, agnosticism, Hinduism, Islam, or whatever. So from my point of view, I don't think that's a problem, but I must say that many times my opponents will allow it to degenerate into sort of personal attacks upon me as an individual.
And indeed, again, you only have to spend a little time on the relevant blogs on the internet, perhaps the Richard Dawkins forum, for instance, and any thread bearing your name has an awful lot of choice words that the atheists there use for you. Does any of that get to you, or is it water off a duck's back?
Well, I'll tell you what, Justin, it doesn't get to me because I don't read it. I've never read that stuff. It only gets to me third or fourth hand, and I'm so glad because from what I hear, some of it really is very vicious. So I simply don't read those kinds of things. And so I am in blissful ignorance of what these folks are saying about me personally.
I have a friend who's been on the show a few times. Former atheist, now a Christian, who participated for a number of years in the Dawkins blogs and things. And he refers to what he calls emotional atheism, which is where he feels the vast majority of people contributing on those kinds of blogs are. They're not actually that interested in reasoned argument. They have an emotional problem with Christianity, with faith. It's usually something in the past that is causing this kind of aggressiveness, this name calling, and the rest of it. What's your view? Is there an emotional atheism that you come across?
Oh, I think that's very true, Justin. Although these folks love to posture themselves as intellectually dubious of Christianity or having intellectual difficulties, I think at root for most of them it's purely emotional. But you see, it's socially unacceptable to just have emotional reasons for rejecting God or Christianity. So there's tremendous pressure to make oneself look respectable in one's unbelief by posturing this as though it were intellectual problems. But it doesn't take very long in talking with these folks to realize that they've never done any serious study of the issue. They don't know the literature. They're unfamiliar with the arguments pro and con, and that it basically is an emotional problem. Now, having said that, there certainly is an academic atheism in the scholarly realm that is also very substantive and needs to be dealt with, but we're talking now about the sort of things that you see on the internet and YouTube.
Yeah, and the worst thing I find is when Christians or people who call themselves Christians retaliate in kind in any way, because then when you stoop to the level of name-calling, it quickly does degenerate.
Yes, I was surprised to see on my Facebook page the other day some Christians responding to one of these atheist videos by saying, "I hate that guy," And I thought, oh, that is not the way a follower of Christ should be responding.
Coming to the average Christian, Bill, they might be rather daunted by your record, PhDs, a resume the length of your arm. I mean, what's your advice to the Christian simply talking with their sceptical, non-believing friend over their garden fence or down in the pub? What's the simple thing that they can do if they're just starting out in this area?
I think that we need to understand that we don't lead with apologetic arguments. I think with most people, you just simply share with them what Christ means to you and how he's changed your life and the difference that's made. And you only recur to arguments and evidence if the unbeliever then has questions or objections. And that's where it's good to have these resources at your fingertips. But anyone can share the gospel and share his personal testimony with another individual. And then if that person asks a question that you don't know the answer to, be honest and say, that's a really good question. I don't know, but I'll look into it. Let me find out, and then let's get back together and talk some more.
Great advice. Bill, what do you do to relax when you're not preparing for debates, writing books, editing journals? What do you do to just take time out?
Well, we have a very large front and back garden at our house, and I am in constant war with the weeds every weekend. So I take out my stresses by yanking out these weeds out of the garden everywhere, and it takes a few hours on Saturday morning to go out and do this. And so that's a great way to relieve stress. And Jan and I have also taken up ballroom dancing in the last couple of years, and I really enjoy that as well. I'm not very good at it, but I sure find it a great deal of fun.
Well, that's a new one on me. Bill Craig, the ballroom dancer. Who knows? Maybe there's a second career there, Bill, if this one starts to flag.
Probably not, but yeah, you should see me tango.
Did you ever consider doing anything else? I mean, at what point did you realise you were going to be a philosopher, and particularly in this area of Christian apologetics? Did you consider any other form of ministry or career?
At one point, I thought about whether God might call me into the pastorate to be a minister of a church, but I didn't feel called to that sort of professional pastoral ministry. My burden was more itinerant, sharing the message of the gospel as broadly as I could with people. And it was in college that I think the vision of doing this in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the faith began to gel. And it was there that I had the vision of becoming someone who would share the gospel while presenting good arguments and evidence in favor of the Christian faith.
How important is it, though, to be linked into a church when you're doing your kind of work, Bill?
Well, I think it's vital for every Christian, Justin. I think that this younger generation that sort of does electronic church is really missing the New Testament model. We are to be part of a local body of Christians. We are given a spiritual gift by the Holy Spirit to use in the context of that local body. And if we do not, we are impairing, we are damaging the body of Christ because we are a dysfunctional member. So we think that it's vital to be involved in a local church, not only in being spiritually refreshed and nourished and having a place to worship corporately, but also in contributing and exercising your spiritual gift.
I guess one of the frustrations some people come across is that they don't feel there's enough apologetics training in churches. For others, Christians, they're not interested in that. That they like the praise and worship or, another aspect of the ministry there. I mean, are we failing young people by not focusing enough on preparing them for when they will inevitably run into those tough questions when they go to university?
I think we are failing them, Justin. If we simply read our children Bible stories and give them entertainment and emotional worship experiences, then we are leaving them unprepared for the tremendous intellectual challenges that they will encounter in secondary school and at university, and the horrible attrition in the ranks of Christian teenagers that is going on today is testimony to how poorly we've prepared them. So I think that it is vital that Christian parents from a very early age begin to teach their children to think as Christians, to think Christianly about the world, and to equip them with increasing sophistication as they grow older to articulate and defend what we as Christians believe.
As you stated at the beginning, you're not there to win an argument, you're there to win people. Do you see people becoming Christians through your ministry?
We really do, Justin. And not only do we experience that personally when I speak on a campus and people will sometimes register commitments that are made through comment cards in the meetings, but also the wonderful emails that we receive weekly from people all around the world saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has transformed my life." People who have been atheists and become Christians, people who were once Christians and fell away from the faith and have now come back to a vital faith in Christ. It is so encouraging. Not to speak of, Justin, the energizing effect that this has had in the lives of people who are Christian believers. I thought that this kind of ministry would enervate people intellectually and strengthen them intellectually. But what I did not suspect and did not expect was the tremendous spiritual revival that this has brought in the lives of so many people. Because once they become really confident that this is the truth, it has an energizing effect in them that makes them want to share the gospel, that gives them a zeal for God and a desire to read His Word and know Him. I have been really shocked by the spiritual impact that this sort of intellectual ministry has had in the lives of so many people.
Well, there you go. Quite an interesting array of things that Bill had to share there in that interview. I hope you enjoyed that. And as I say, if you want to listen to the full interview, we're putting it up in the features section of the Unbelievable website, premier.org.uk/unbelievable, to listen to my full conversation with Bill, running to some 40 minutes or so. If you would like to find out more about the tour and indeed about the day conference where Bill is speaking alongside other significant Christian speakers, then do check out premier.org.uk/Craig. Well, one of those speakers is going to be Professor John Lennox, who's going to be addressing the recent book by Stephen Hawking, claiming that God is redundant as a cause of the universe according to science. Well, he's going to be responding to those claims and to the claims of the new atheism in regards to science. John is a fascinating man, and he sat down with me recently to talk about his life and the impact he's having in the whole debate on God, science and religion.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
John, thank you for joining me. Lots of people are familiar with your name now because you've done a couple of very high-profile debates with Richard Dawkins. Many people perhaps see you as his opposite number in some ways, also an Oxford professor by background, but one who obviously differs significantly in your attitude to faith and belief. Tell us, bring it back to the start, how did it start for you? Did you have a Christian faith growing up? Was it something you came at later on?
Yes, I had a Christian faith growing up. My parents were evangelical Christians, so were their parents in Northern Ireland. I think the unique feature of my growing up was that my parents, though convinced Christians, gave me space to think and encouraged me to read very widely other worldviews other than Christian. And so I came up to university having read a great deal, probably more than the average Christian might have. And it was at Cambridge that I got involved very early on in the public defence of Christianity, in a sense. I was challenged at my first week at Cambridge. Somebody asked me, did I believe in God? And then they said, of course you do, you're Irish, and they all believe in God over there. They fight about it. I'd heard the question before, but somehow I felt at that time it was important to settle it at a deeper level. So I deliberately set about getting to know, befriending, talking to people who didn't share my worldview. And I've been doing it ever since.
Absolutely. What were some of the biggest questions you came across as you befriended people with other worldviews?
Well, it's ultimately a question of truth. Is the Christian faith true? And of course, I'm a scientist, so in one sense, historically, I'm very prejudiced in favour of Christianity because it was belief in God that arguably set science going, modern science, in the 16th and 17th centuries. And the rational intelligibility of the universe, for me, is one of the great evidences that there is a God. The fact that we can do science, so to speak, is evidence for God. And so I was interacting not simply with scientific people who felt that the evidence was the other way, and I wanted to know what that evidence was, but also with people in the humanities who had different views that were relativistic, sometimes views that were essentially communist, Marxist, and so on. And by constantly asking myself questions and exposing my faith in God to these alternative views, the effect of it was, over the years, to strengthen my faith in God, that Christianity, in the end, was by far and away the best explanatory fit at that level. And then, of course, there's the personal dimension as well, the experience of God in my own daily life.
I think many people probably almost go a completely different route. They think, if I'm going to keep my faith secure, I need to shield it from any other points of view. That gives rise to a sort of Christian bubble very often.
Yes, it does. It develops a ghetto mentality, and it's very sad because the very first commandment, after all, is to love the Lord our God with our mind. And it's sad because it indicates that people somehow feel that they might learn something that is true that upsets them. But if there is a God, he is the truth. And after all, one of the central claims of Jesus himself was, I am the truth. Not simply I speak true things, although that's true. It's I am the truth, that he is the ultimate truth. And I regard myself at that level on a kind of quest. What is ultimate truth? What is ultimate reality? And to be afraid of something new seems to me to contradict the very thing I'm supposed to believe in.
You've been unafraid, in a sense, of linking scientific evidences to proofs for God. Some people sort of are very keen to shy away from that. They say you shouldn't mix up God and science. God is the concepts of God and theology are asking certain questions, answering certain questions, and science is a completely different sphere, if you like. But you don't see it that way. You do
no,
see
I
that
don't.
there are...
I disagree entirely with Stephen Jay Gould, who talked about non-overlapping magisteria. I think there is a grain of truth in that. Crudely put, science tends to answer the how questions, and Christianity deals with the deeper why questions. But that's not good enough for a very simple reason, that the Bible does talk about the physical universe. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It says, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. In other words, it's making a comment on the genesis of the universe and life as we know it. So there is an overlap. The second thing is that the Apostle Paul, in his central defense of the Christian gospel, the letter he wrote to Rome, says that the invisible things of God, that is his great power and his Godhead, the fact that there is a God, are clearly seen from the things that are made. In other words, Paul, as one of his first arguments in his defense of the Christian message, says that the universe provides a perception. It's not neutral in the question of God. And that's an axiom for me, really, that I expect to see signs of God's activity in the universe itself.
Going to Dawkins and the debates you've had with him, he and his fellow sort of atheist scientists, many of them want to say these days that science has, if you like, given us pause to question God, that in fact, if anything, science leads to atheism. You're obviously saying something quite different. If anything, science is opening up questions that make us wonder, well, perhaps there is a God after all. Now, why is that voice of the atheist scientist so persuasive at the moment? We seem to be getting multiple newspaper articles, books coming out from atheists who are wanting to bang this drum about science leading towards non-belief in God. What's the cause, as far as you see it, for this suddenly being the tenor of the scientific community at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's the complete tenor of the scientific community. It's that there are a few very strident voices in the scientific community. And I notice that some of those voices are distancing themselves increasingly from the branch of atheism that Dawkins is representing. You're quite right. He claims to be able to effectively deduce his atheism from science. I actually think it's nonsense. And nonsense in a very strict sense, because if his atheism is true, it means that the mind that he thinks his atheism up with is simply the human brain, and the brain is the product of an unguided, mindless process. And as philosophers are increasingly pointed out, that gives him a major cognitive problem, because the process that produced his brain was not geared to truth, it was geared to reproductive success. And so his argument, taken to its logical conclusion, undermines the very rationality that you need to do science, let alone anything to do with God. So I feel his atheism is logically incoherent and self-destructive. I know that's a pretty strong statement, but that's the way it seems to be. It has become very popular. These books are popular, but I suspect there's an element other than the scientific involved in that popularity. There is a moral rebellion in the human heart against God, and we've got to take that on board as well. And there is a sense in which many people want atheism to be true. And I think that's a very important thing to analyse. There's a brilliant book, a bestseller in Germany at the moment, by a psychiatrist called Manfred Lutz. It's called A Short History of the Great One. And he makes the point that Freud gives you a brilliant analysis of why religion is a delusion, provided God doesn't exist. But if God does exist, Freud gives you an equally brilliant analysis of the fact that atheism is a delusion. And it's a very powerfully written book, and his punchline is, but on the question of whether God exists or not, Freud won't help you at all. There you have to go for the evidence. And that for me is the key thing. Dawkins methinks he protests too much. He insists on evidence, but I don't see him taking seriously the evidence, the intellectual evidence for Christianity, certainly not in his recent book, The God Delusion. And that's why I wrote my book, God's Undertaker.
And presumably the reason why you're involved with things like the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, you're looking to equip Christians to answer the questions of non-Christians, and also to put that worldview as being a rational one, that we don't have to buy into a kind of atheist scientific mentality.
Yes, I want to share with the Christian population in general the fact that there's no need at all to be ashamed of the gospel of Christ, of the good news, of belief in God and the Bible, because it fits with science and there are answers. I don't say they're exhaustive answers, but answers to these deep questions of life sufficient to really found your life on. And I try as best I can to, in public and in private, to encourage people to think hard about these things.
Well, thank you for helping us to think, John, and thanks for being with me today.
Not at all. It's a pleasure, Justin.
Join us again in a short moment's time for more on Unbelievable as we look ahead to the National Bethinking Day Conference on Apologetics coming up on Saturday the 22nd of October. I'm going to be joined in the next section of the programme by Gary Habermas and Peter J. Williams, two more guests on the roster. I do hope you can join me for that in just a moment's time.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, the show that aims to get you thinking. Today we're playing out some interviews that I've recorded both recently and in the more distant past with some of the people who will be represented in terms of speaking at the Bethinking National Apologetics Day Conference coming up in 3 weeks' time, Saturday the 22nd of October, central London. It's at Westminster Chapel. It's going to be a great day of teaching. You won't want to miss it. Do book yourself in. We've already heard from William Lane Craig and John Lennox. Well, the two other speakers who are going to be on the lineup are Gary Habermas and Peter J. Williams. Peter J. Williams will be joining me in a little moment's time later on in the show. Right now, I want to play out something of an interview that I did with Gary Habermas some time back now, but very relevant in terms of the content as regards the topic he's going to be presenting on at the conference. That is, of course, the resurrection, which is really been a lifelong, as it were, area of expertise for Gary Habermas. So this is Gary Habermas and myself in conversation. It's great to have you on, though, Gary, and your reputation precedes you. I mean, if you were to ask many people in the Christian world, you know, if you want someone to explain the resurrection, the name Gary Habermas would probably be not far from their lips. So tell us a little bit, first of all, Gary, about yourself. Growing up, you grew up in a sort of Christian environment, did you?
Yes, I am in our country. I was born and raised in Detroit, the Detroit, Michigan area, and I was raised in a Christian home, and I started questioning my salvation when I was a teenager, and it got pretty, it was pretty severe by my standards. I went through a period of about 10 years where I questioned the faith, and I think the thing I struggled with the most was whether there was any meaning in life, any hope, any future, any objective truth. And I remember thinking once in a while about Edgar Allan Poe's publications, and where people are buried and sort of the leaves blow over their grave, and it's always the fall of the year, and there they are, the grave's covered, and nothing else is going on because they're not alive. You know, they don't exist anywhere. And that was one of the images I used to have in my mind in those days, and I kind of centered on the resurrection because I tried several major evidences that Christians claimed were good, and I just didn't think any of them. I thought they were either not good or, you know, decent but not decisive. And then I settled on the resurrection, and I realized that if Jesus was raised, Christianity was true. I would grant that, but I spent years and years on the resurrection and just couldn't get it into my head that it was really an event. And so one other incident, late in my doubt, I'd already had my, I'd done graduate studies, and my mom called me one day to see how I was doing, and I told her that I thought the doubt had sort of won, and that I was pretty sure I was becoming a Buddhist.
A Buddhist?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I mean, when I say I kind of seriously dwelt into it, I don't see that lightly. In fact, I woke up a day or two and thought I'd already slipped into Buddhism. I'd already become a Buddhist. So it was pretty intense, and the resurrection was always the star. And I always realized if it did what it claimed to do, it would pull me out of this. But I wasn't secure that it could actually do that. And then I kind of broke through, and I finished my PhD dissertation at a secular school is on the resurrection. So I kind of say to myself that was sort of the end of my searching. It wasn't the very end, but I use that sort of metaphorically as the end of my 10 years.
It's fascinating, obviously, that you had that quite extensive period of doubt, as you describe it.
Right.
Many people I know as Christians maybe have some kind of, jitters along the way that may be resolved in all kinds of different ways. But for you, having, if you like, a firm theological and philosophical and factual basis was obviously extremely important to you actually even beginning on believing anything.
Oh, absolutely. Even before I had studied much philosophy at all. It just seemed to me, I don't want to use the word intuitive, that's kind of a bad word for philosophers, but I would just say that before I had formal training, it just made sense to me that if the foundation were not true, I just couldn't be one of those guys who would, quote-unquote, just believe. I needed to have a basis before I could settle back and ask, now what can I be doing about it? Who can I help? Who can I minister to? I kept saying to myself, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but is it true?
And that search for truth, I imagine, has stayed with you. I mean, do you still consider yourself to be someone who, if you like, is always asking questions? You're not sort of, in a sense, do you, once you do sort of stake your claim and say, yes, I do believe now, do you at that point then become the apologist who is always looking for any way to justify what they believe? Or do you believe you are still someone who kind of would say, well, if I was presented with the right evidence that told me no, then I'd have to believe it?
Yeah, I maybe a bit of a crisscross between those two. I definitely am still the kind of person who stops and thinks whenever I see something that purports to be counter to the resurrection or counter to Christianity. I start my morning with a news service, kind of a religious news service that gives me all the news around the world every day, and quite frequently it'll be something contrary to faith, as much, say, for example, the new atheism. And as much as it is for Christianity. Just this morning, an article was published from the Pew Forum in our country, quite a huge group that does a lot of surveying, and it was where Americans are on a variety of topics: God, miracles, demons, angels, heaven, hell. And so I start my morning a lot with these kind of current events-y kind of things. Some of them are technical, some of them are not. But I always have radar out, and I'm always, if I hear something that looks like it goes against Christianity, quite frequently I will drop what I'm doing if that's at all possible. If there's no deadline that's in the next 2 hours, and I'll go through it right then and there. So yeah, I still have a bit of that, but I've also found time in the last 10 or 20 years to settle down and try to do some of the ministry aspects that I always told myself I would do once I knew it was true. And I suppose the biggest areas I work in ministry-wise are with people who doubt. I've written a couple books on doubt, and I've had hundreds of conversations with doubters. I used to take notes on all of them, but it was those interviews that totally changed my mind on what doubt is and what to do about it. And I also, because my wife passed away in 1995 with cancer, I also have been writing some things recently, including 2 books that are due to come out shortly on pain and suffering. But I don't consider doubt and pain, I don't consider those my main area. I still do all my biggest research easily on the resurrection, because as you know, there's no shortage of attacks on the resurrection. So I don't feel I'm ever going to get away from that as my main area.
I guess you were then, and as you have since, you were bringing forward what you call the minimal facts approach to the resurrection. So tell us about this and how you came to this conclusion about a particular way of seeing the evidence for the resurrection.
Well, I started writing on my dissertation back probably 1974, and as I said earlier in the interview, finished it in 76. And as I was reading the scholars who were interacting with the resurrection, I'll just say parenthetically here, or as a footnote, the resurrection scene has changed drastically in 30 years. But as I was reading the people who were writing on the subject in the 70s, Rudolf Bultmann's influence was still huge, and you couldn't find very many non-evangelicals or let's say, a few moderates, but you couldn't find a whole lot of people who were outspoken in favor of the resurrection. And if you found a chapter here and a chapter there, that would be a lot. But what I noticed is that the skeptics and the critics, nobody would make the move that evangelicals frequently make, which which is to argue that the entire New Testament is reliable or somehow trustworthy, let alone that it was inspired. Nobody would make that move in the discussions. But, that wouldn't be their starting point, whatever they believed. But these people would not say, this must have happened because it's in the New Testament, the New Testament's reliable. Rather, I noticed that they argued for particular facts and left the rest of it open. They would leave the rest of the issue open and not answer the particular question. So what I did was I noted their methodology, and I thought, okay, if I use your methodology only, and I will only start with data that the critical community agrees is historical. Now, could I still get to resurrection? Now, when I use that sentence, if I only use material that the critical community agrees is historical, could I get to the resurrection? There's two things here. I developed what I call a minimal facts historical method. So it's a method. That's important. But it has two criterion, and these two criteria are the first one, and by far the most important one, is I will only use data that are multiply attested on critical grounds. In other words, I'll only allow facts to count when I have several ways to come at those facts, and they all look pretty good. My second criteria that's assumed in that sentence is that most of the critics are on board with these data. So I have the first one's most important because somebody will say to me, well, how do you know where most critics are? Well, that question's easy because I'm probably the only guy on the earth that's counted where scholars are, and now I've done it a lot before 1975, but in particular, I started doing a survey of from 1975 to the present, where are critical scholars on the resurrection, and Justin, I have well over 100, probably 140 sub-areas. Now, who would think there are 140 key critical questions starting from the death, burial, and resurrection and the appearances of Jesus? But there's 140 issues, and I would track where scholars are. So if they said to me, how do you know where people are? I'd say, I counted. I counted the major guys who are doing this, and a lot of the minor ones. So then they'd say, well, how do you know scholarship won't change? Well, it might, but that's why the most important thing is the first criterion, which says I accept these facts because there's multiple reasons for each. That's going to stay the same unless we come up with something different. We all tend to be more sure of those things closest to our heart. I mean, I would care if I know you just had a child, you and your wife. I would care, Justin, if you started this interview and said, "Hey, listen, I'm kind of got something heavy on my mind today because one of my children's sick." Well, I would care about your sick child, and I suppose you mine, but I would care more if my child were sick, and vice versa. The things closer to our hearts get more attention. And the fact that everything depends on the resurrection, the fact that it's linked to almost every major area of theology in the New Testament, the fact that it's linked to almost every major area of practice, we know that if it didn't happen, our faith is in vain. So just as non-Christians hit that over and over, we talked about that earlier, Christians keep returning to it too. So when it's the central thing and you spend a lot of time on it and you're using the skeptic's facts, I think this web we're weaving here, right people, right place, right time, right topic, I think we're going after it the way ancient historians do. And I will just add, several critics have said that this case is so tight that you could take it into a law court or into something that would satisfy a modern historian.
Really interesting guy, Gary Habermas. Do check him out as he comes along to the Bethinking National Day Conference on Apologetics, Countering the New Atheism, Saturday the 22nd of October. More details and ways to book in at premier.org.uk/Craig. Well, time to hear from the fourth and final person who'll be joining us for the National Apologetics Conference, the Bethinking Day Conference, on Saturday the 22nd of October in a few weeks' time. Peter J. Williams is going to be one of the speakers, and it's my great pleasure to have him with me here in the studio today. Thank you very much for joining me, Peter. We've heard some of the contributions from some of the other guests who are going to be appearing and speaking at the conference, and we're looking forward to a fantastic day of teaching, etc. You're going to be tackling, though, and one of the things that have come up a lot recently in various forms, which is the Old Testament, and particularly the question of whether God, as represented in the Old Testament, is some kind of a moral monster. Seems to come up in various ways. Before we get to that, let's do a little introduction to you. You are the warden of Tyndale House in Cambridge. Tell me, what does Tyndale House do in Cambridge?
Well, we've got the best library on the Bible in Britain.
You look like that's a badge of honour for you.
There is no competition, and we have about 40 or 50 people there studying at a doctoral or postdoctoral level on a daily basis, doing degrees in different universities and so on, but using this space. And then, based on the intellectual life there, we do various things like conferences and other activities, but the core is a residential library.
You yourself are something of an expert in the Old and New Testament. It's something you've devoted your life to. You're going to be joining us again next week, and we'll get a bit more of your background to how you got into the Old and New Testament studies that form the academic life that you pursue now. But right now, it'd be interesting to hear what you're going to be talking about at the conference. Tell us what you're going to be speaking on there.
Well, what's been happening in recent years, it's not particularly new, but people have been making a very strong narrative associating violence and religion, essentially telling the history of the last few thousand years and saying this has been a regular correlation. And then after 9/11, there's a far closer correlation in many people's minds between violence and religion. And then people have been attacking the Old Testament and saying, well, look, isn't this a text which promotes violence in the name of religion, in the name of God, and so therefore is immoral and really needs to be spoken against. And I'm going to be responding to that, looking at whether those comparisons are fair, arguing that they're basically not, and that what people do when they get upset at some of the stories in the Old Testament is often they read them very selectively. So, if you like, they read the story of a man walking past someone he's never met in the street and, pushing him to the floor, and they say, that is the story, it's obviously immoral, when in fact there's all sorts of other qualifications, like... You
don't know the backstory of how that, the relationship they've had up to that point.
Exactly. You saw the man was in danger, which is why you pushed him to the ground. So I think there are a huge number of qualifications in the story of and I'm particularly going to be focusing on what people see as the hardest story, which when God commands his people Israel to go in and drive out 7 nations from the land of Canaan and destroy them. That, at first glance, to us just looks, it must be morally wrong. And I want to make a case why actually that command does fit with most people's moral intuitions.
That's interesting. So you're going to be making the case that far from being an immoral thing that we try to somehow brush under the carpet, if at all possible, that there is actually a moral case to be made for the command that God issued.
I will.
In those
I mean, it takes time, and I can't do it in 10 minutes.
No. Well, turn up for the conference to hear the full explanation. I mean, this is something that so often does come up, though. People will very often, when we've done, for instance, discussions on this programme on the moral argument for God, which is a sort of philosophical argument for the existence of God based on the fact that we perceive objective moral values, yet we can't have those without a kind of transcendent moral lawgiver. Well, the first thing an atheist will say is, well, you say that, but where if you look at the Bible, I don't see these great moral values there. I see these terrible stories in the Old Testament and these Old Testament laws, which, we all think are horrendous these days. I got a question, in fact, from an atheist recently, Trevor, who says, in the Old Testament, God can seem incapable of tolerating sin. If you look at, certain commandments, even things like, some people who transgress the Sabbath, get stoned and that sort of thing. But at other times, he seems to aim merely for a modest improval over the cultural norms of the time. For example, specifying to the extent to which you can punish a slave in Exodus. Can these fit into a consistent picture of the Old Testament God and his morals? So it's that whole question of, what was God doing in the Old Testament when it came to the moral precepts that seem to be laid down, some of which seem so terrible and over the top in terms of our moral view today. And other times people argue that, they were just gradually getting better, perhaps, in that sort of way.
Well, I think it's Richard Dawkins who uses the word weird of the Old Testament, just its weirdness. And I think there is a strangeness to us because you're dealing with a situation which is far distant from us, both in space and time. And just as we find other cultures weird when we go to them today, we suddenly find very bizarre things going on. That's all the more when you're dealing with an ancient text. But I do think that with any of these cultures, when you get to know them better, it becomes more comprehensible. So we have some rather weird things in our society. For instance, in Britain, you could be shot for carrying a heavy rucksack, jumping over security in an airport and running fast and not responding to calls. I mean, you think, well, that's a bit strange. Why would you shoot someone for running? And I think sometimes we can look at laws in the Old Testament a bit like that. So you can have a command, for instance, which says, this is from Exodus 21, verse 15, whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. And for us, that seems absolutely bizarre that you would have death penalty for that. But I do think that societies can sometimes have very strict laws provided people know them up front. Now, we all know the law about not jumping over the barriers with a rucksack on your back through airport security.
And we know the context of why that law has been developed.
Yeah, and so you know that there are certain extreme situations. And here we have a society in which there is an order of authority. Were lots of people executed under this? We don't know that any were, because you knew up front. So I think what you can have is what you've got to think is, well, who are father and mother? Father and mother are the people who gave you life. They're the people who brought you into the world. And obviously it's a very serious thing for someone to turn around and to strike someone in that situation. The other thing, of course, people find difficult is, why so much death penalty and so on? Why not put them in prison? Well, of course, you cannot have prisons unless you have surplus in your society. So this is a very sort of modern idea. It's essentially a luxury. When you read ancient accounts of prisons and dungeons, they were things basically only the monarch might have in certain societies because he had the luxury of being able to, make people really suffer in some dungeon. But it requires a surplus. So what we have essentially in the Old Testament are pecuniary punishments where people are fined. You have corporal punishments and you have the capital punishment as the basic sets of things available. But you don't have to think for very long about an ancient society to realise that there aren't that many things that you can do in a subsistent society. And so I do think that has to be taken into context.
It's fascinating stuff. I mean, I suppose it is about trying to get behind the text and sort of putting yourself in the context of the situation that those laws were speaking into. And I'm sure that'll be part of what you're talking about when it comes to those apparent barbaric commands of driving out the inhabitants of, the Canaanites and everything. That there was a social structure to be understood and why they might be being commanded to do that.
Yeah, well, and much more. It's really one of the main arguments is going to be about the character of God and the nature of the story. Now, what I think atheists do is a bit naughty, is they launch two simultaneous attacks. They say, one, the story isn't true, two, it's immoral. Now, if you're going to deal with the morality of a story, it actually doesn't matter whether it's true or not. You can suspend that whole question. But what they do, because they've said it's not true, is they then retell the story with God and miracles and divine communication missing. So they actually tell the story as if a group of people have, taken it upon themselves to go into a land and destroy people. They miss out the fact that God did most of the fighting. They miss out the fact that 600,000 people were told, communicated to by God. They miss out the real guilt of the inhabitants. They just say, that's part of the propaganda. But actually, if you're dealing with a story, you have to take the story as it stands. So I can't read the Odyssey and judge the morality of Odysseus without taking into account that Athena spoke to him. I may not believe in Athena, but in terms of the story, I have to do that.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, we then need to divide two different questions. One is, was it moral for God to command this? And two is, was it lawful for and moral for the people to obey the command if it had indeed been given by God in the way it was described? So that's the way I would set up the question. Now, it seemed to me that if someone, let's say Neptune, appeared out of the sea, 100 feet tall, above you, and told you to do something that otherwise you wouldn't do, that you'd have a pretty good excuse before a jury if that really had happened. It's a game-changing thing. So actually, you can make a very good case for exonerating the Israelites from personal guilt, and then that shifts the question of was God legitimately authorized to do it? And then you have to say, well, who is God in the story? Well, God in the story is the person who made everything, who sustains everything, who's told these people, not to commit the sins they've done, who's waited 400 years, so he's extremely patient. That's the God in the story. I can't miss out those bits without actually telling a different story. So in a sense, if the story were the way the atheists told the story, I would also think it was immoral. But I think there are a number of factors we can bring together and say, no, the story as it's put in the Bible is something rather different.
Fascinating. Well, hear the full story, as it were, on Saturday the 22nd. Peter Williams will be one of the speakers at the Bethinking National Apologetics Day Conference. Countering the New Atheism is the subtitle of that conference, and I hope you can be there to see him and indeed William Lane Craig, John Lennox and Gary Habermas, all in their respective fields, tackling some of the difficult questions that the New Atheists have of Christianity in today's cultural climate. Hope you can be there for that. Saturday the 22nd of October, 3 weeks' time, 3 weeks as of today's programme. So do book yourself in. It's all available. You can find out more about the conference at bethinking.org/Craig. And indeed find out the details of all of William Lane Craig's various lectures and debates going on around the country. You can also go straight to the ticket hotline, premier.org.uk/Craig, to book yourself in, both for that conference and indeed the many other events going on around the country. Starting off, of course, on Monday the 17th of October with a debate at Westminster Central Hall. Does God exist? That'll be the question, and William Lane Craig will be debating atheist philosopher Stephen Law at Westminster Central Hall, Monday the 17th of October. I'll be your host for that debate, and it'll be great to welcome a great crowd there to witness that debate. Why not tell your friends about it too? An ideal event to bring along someone else too as well, whether you're a believer or a skeptic or somewhere in between. So that's all coming up. We've got some of your feedback as well to the previous few weeks of programming coming up too in just a moment's time. In the meantime, thank you very much to my studio guest today, Peter Williams.
Thank you.
Thanks to those who we've heard from as well in the course of the programme. And we'll be back in just a moment's time with the rest of today's programme, Unbelievable.